every great empire believed the same thing. Rome believed it would last forever. The Ottomans believed they stood at the center of the world. Britain believed the sun would never set on its empire. The Soviet Union believed collapse was impossible. And in the end, they all fell. What's strange is this: they almost all collapsed in the exact same way. Because most empires are not destroyed by enemies from the outside. They decay slowly from within. Money, debt, corruption, overexpansion, and eventually, people stop believing in the system itself. History changes, flags change, but the pattern rarely does. This is economic legacy, where history meets financial power. And maybe the most uncomfortable question is this: what if the same cycle is happening again today? Empires usually do not begin with luxury. They begin with discipline. Think about early Rome. Citizens were soldiers. Leaders lived simply. The state focused more on survival than comfort. The rise of the Ottoman Empire followed a similar path. Strong institutions, controlled taxation, disciplined armies, strategic control of trade routes. Britain rose through shipping, finance, and industrial power at the beginning. Empires grow because they are efficient, not because they are rich. But eventually, something changes. Success becomes routine. Routine creates complacency, and complacency slowly weakens the system. As empires become wealthier, their elites begin to change. The first generation builds the system. The second expands it. The third consumes the wealth it created. In Rome, senators became unimaginably rich. Luxury villas expanded across the empire, while corruption spread through politics. In the later years of the Ottoman Empire, palace spending increased, while the state struggled to adapt to a changing world. Britain controlled global trade, but maintaining a worldwide empire became increasingly expensive, because every empire eventually falls into the same trap: the need for endless expansion. An empire cannot stop growing. The moment expansion slows, income weakens. Armies are expensive. Navies are expensive. Bureaucracy is expensive. And this is where one of history's most dangerous systems appears: debt. Rome solved its problems by reducing the silver content in its coins. The currency looked the same, but its value quietly declined. An early form of inflation. People slowly began losing trust in money itself. Prices rose. Soldiers demanded higher pay. The state created even more currency, and the cycle began. Centuries later, the same thing happened again. Spain flooded Europe with gold and silver from the Americas. At first, it created immense wealth. But eventually, too much precious metal entered the economy, and prices exploded. Ironically, excessive wealth weakened the system. Britain financed wars through massive borrowing. Modern central banking grew stronger during this era. Debt makes empires appear powerful in the short term. But over time, it makes them fragile, because eventually the economy stops producing and begins working only to sustain the system itself. This is one of the most important stages of decline: the separation between real productivity and the illusion of prosperity. In the final centuries of Rome, production slowed while elite lifestyles continued. In the late Ottoman period, old displays of power remained even as trade routes lost importance. The Soviet Union looked powerful from the outside, but inside, store shelves were empty, because empires often appear strongest right before collapse. Sometimes their most impressive moments happen just before the fall. And that's why people rarely see the end coming. Rome still had massive monuments. Britain still controlled a quarter of the world. The Soviets had sent humans into space. But internally, the foundations were already breaking apart. And collapse is never only economic. It is psychological. Because the real thing holding an empire together is not military strength. It is belief. The moment people stop believing in the system, collapse accelerates. Think about bank runs. A bank may not technically be bankrupt, but if everyone rushes to withdraw money at once, the system fails. Empires work the same way. When people stop believing taxes are fair, when they believe leaders only protect themselves, when trust in money begins to disappear decline quietly begins. In Rome, civic identity faded. In the Ottoman Empire, central authority weakened. In the Soviet Union, people stopped believing in the ideology itself. And once trust disappears, even the largest systems begin cracking from within. But perhaps the greatest mistake every empire makes is this: they begin managing the illusion instead of reality. Because during periods of decline, leaders often focus more on appearances than solutions. More money is printed, more propaganda is created, more displays of power appear. But these things only delay the inevitable. Rome hired more soldiers, Britain tried to maintain more colonies, the Soviets increased political control, but the deeper economic and psychological fractures continue growing underneath. And eventually another stage appears: extreme inequality. Throughout history, wealth often becomes concentrated into the hands of a small elite shortly before decline. In late Rome, giant landowners accumulated enormous power, while small farmers disappeared. Before the French Revolution, the gap between aristocrats and ordinary people became unbearable. And in the modern world, similar debates continue today. Housing costs, debt, income, inequality, corporate power. Because inequality is not only an economic issue, it destroys social trust. People begin feeling the system no longer works for them. And once again, history repeats itself. Empires rarely die from external attacks alone. Rome was already weakening long before the barbarians arrived. The Ottoman Empire was not destroyed only by war. It also struggled to adapt economically to a changing global system. The Soviet Union was not defeated only by the United States. It collapsed under the weight of its own structure. Because no empire is eternal. Eventually, every system becomes too large, too expensive, and too dependent on preserving itself. The bigger the empire becomes, the more difficult it is to sustain. And eventually the system stops building the future and begins desperately protecting the present. That is the final stage. Rome shifted into defense. Britain slowly lost its colonies. The Soviet Union attempted reforms to save the system. But by then, the cycle had already begun. And perhaps the strangest part is this: no empire truly believes it can collapse. Romans believed they lived at the center of civilization. British elites believed their dominance would last forever. The Soviets believed history itself guaranteed their victory. But history does not run on emotions. It runs on cycles: rise, expansion, wealth, debt, corruption, loss of trust, collapse. Then a new power rises and the cycle begins again. Maybe. That's why the most important question is not how empires rise, but what actually keeps them alive. Military power, gold, technology, maybe none of them. Because the systems that survive the longest are usually the ones capable of maintaining trust. When people believe work still has meaning, when they trust the value of money, when they believe the system has not completely rotted, the empire survives. But once trust disappears, decline begins. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. A silent decay lasting decades. The modern world may look different. Empires no longer fight with swords or wooden ships. But power still follows the same psychology. Debt continues growing. Currencies continue changing. Global influence shifts between nations. And trust in institutions becomes increasingly fragile. Which means history is not just the past. It is a warning. Because every empire made the same mistake, believing their system would last forever. But no power in history ever truly did. Only the cycle survived. And maybe the most terrifying part is this: humanity acts as if it is experiencing this cycle for the very first time, even though history keeps whispering the same message. No empire is invincible, and every empire eventually falls the same way.